The day began like any other, but with a bit of unexpected ease. After the first round of student defenses, I waited for the next batch. Only 2 out of the 6 students showed up, making my workload lighter. With the papers defended and feedback given, I compiled the necessary reports and headed to the administration office. The first student, Emily, walked in nervously, clutching her paper. I could see the anxiety in her eyes as she handed it over. "Relax, Emily," I said, giving her an encouraging smile. "You've done well all semester. Let's see what you've got." She presented her work on quantum mechanics with surprising confidence, answering my questions thoroughly. Her explanations were clear, and it was evident she had put in a lot of effort. "Excellent job, Emily," I said as she finished. "You've really grasped the concepts well. Keep up the good work." She beamed with relief and gratitude, thanked me, and left the room. Next was Jason, one of my top students. He had been looking forward to this moment and was well prepared. His paper on theoretical physics was insightful, and his defense was equally impressive. "Mr. Bell, I wanted to thank you for all your guidance this semester," Jason said, his voice filled with genuine appreciation. "I couldn't have done this without your help." "You've done most of the work, Jason," I replied, shaking his hand. "Keep pushing yourself and you'll go far." With the defenses complete, I compiled the necessary feedback and documentation. I walked over to the administration office to submit the reports. "Morning, Mrs. Thompson." I greeted the office secretary, handing her the stack of papers. "Just the reports from today's defenses." She looked up from her desk, smiling warmly. "Thank you, Andrew. How did it go?" "Quite well, actually. Only 2 students showed up, so it was a lot quicker than usual." "That's a nice surprise," she replied. "Enjoy the rest of your day." With the workday over earlier than expected, I decided to do something special for Margaret. I'd been thinking about surprising her with something nice, and a bouquet out of her favorite gladioli seemed perfect. I made a detour to the local flower shop on my way home. The bell above the door chimed as I entered, and the familiar scent of fresh flowers filled the air. Mrs. Fields, the florist, greeted me with a warm smile. "Good afternoon, Andrew. What can I get for you today?" "Hello, Mrs. Fields. A bouquet of gladioli, please. Margaret's favorite." While Mrs. Fields arranged the flowers, I browsed the shop, enjoying the brief respite from my routine. A few minutes later, I was back on the street, gladioli in hand, heading toward home. On the way, I bumped into an old colleague, Peter. We hadn't seen each other in ages, so we decided to grab a quick coffee at a nearby cafe. "Andrew, long time no see," Peter exclaimed, clapping me on the back as we sat down. "It's been a while, Peter. How have you been?" We chatted for a bit about work, life, and the latest developments in the physics world. It was refreshing to catch up and share a few laughs. "Well, I should get going. These flowers won't deliver themselves," I said, standing up and showing him the bouquet. Peter grinned. "Margaret is a lucky woman." "Take care, Andrew." With a wave, I continued my journey home. But as I walked, I couldn't shake off a strange feeling. It was probably nothing, just a lingering thought from my conversation with Peter. Still, I quickened my pace, eager to see Margaret and give her the flowers. When I turned the corner onto our street, I noticed something odd. A car I didn't recognize was parked in front of our house. My curiosity piqued. I walked up the driveway, wondering if Margaret had company. Entering the house, I called out, "Margaret, I'm home." There was no response. I frowned and moved further into the house. The living room was dark and empty, so I headed upstairs, the gladioli still in my hand. I noticed a soft light coming from under the bathroom door and heard faint noises. My heart pounded as I approached. Pushing the door slightly open, I was immediately greeted by the sight of Margaret and Paul, her colleague from the startup she worked at. They were in the shower, their bodies entangled. Through the large mirror on the wall, I could see everything. Margaret stood with her back to Paul as he kissed her neck, his hands exploring her body, moving from her stomach to her chest, and then lower. I realized there was no point in shouting. I needed to be calm, to show courage. I let the flowers slip from my hand, scattering across the floor. Without hesitation, I pushed the bathroom door open further and walked straight into the shower, still in my outerwear. Margaret's eyes widened in shock as she saw me. "Andrew, I can explain." I cut her off, my voice steady. "Don't even think about leaving the house, either of you." Paul looked mortified, trying to cover himself as he stumbled out of the shower. Margaret stood there, dripping and embarrassed, as I turned and left the bathroom. The house felt empty and cold, the weight of betrayal heavy on my shoulders. I walked downstairs, sat on the couch, and stared at nothing in particular. I gathered the scattered flowers from the floor, feeling the wetness seep into my pants from the shower. As I placed the gladioli on the kitchen counter, I heard the bathroom door open. Margaret and Paul emerged, both looking uncomfortable. Paul had managed to get dressed quickly, his shirt buttoned hastily and hair still damp. I turned to Margaret, holding out the flowers with a sardonic grin. "Gladioli are your favorite, right?" Margaret blushed deeply, her shame evident. She couldn't meet my eyes and didn't take the flowers from my hand. Instead, she walked over to the nightstand, grabbed a vase, and placed the flowers inside. This small act seemed to magnify her guilt and embarrassment. An idea began to form in my mind. Margaret and Paul had been working on a startup, something she had always kept me at arm's length from. I barely knew anything about Paul except that he was a colleague from her college days, and I had no clue what their project was about. It wasn't related to physics or any scientific endeavor, as Margaret had never been interested in those areas. As they both stood there, awkward and silent, I decided to break the tension. "Paul," I said, turning to face him directly, "do you think it's okay to fuck other people's wives?" Paul's face turned pale and he shook his head vigorously. "No, no way, that's disgusting." I laughed bitterly. "Well, then perhaps you should feel a strong disgust for yourself, right?" "Yes, of course," he stammered, looking like he wanted to be anywhere but here. It was clear Paul was desperate to escape. He agreed to everything I said, his discomfort palpable. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on me. Here was a man who had no qualms about betraying trust, but now stood quaking at the thought of facing the consequences. "Okay, go already," I said, waving my hand dismissively. "Otherwise, you'll lose consciousness here and we'll have to waste time calling an ambulance for you." Paul didn't need to be told twice. He practically ran out of the house, not daring to look back. The sound of the front door slamming echoed through the hall, leaving Margaret and me in a heavy silence. I turned to Margaret, who was now seated on the edge of the bed, staring at the floor. "Beautiful gladioli, aren't they?" I said, my voice barely holding back the tremble. She looked up, tears welling in her eyes. "Yes, beautiful. Thank you very much." A part of me wanted to lash out, to verbally insult her, to ask who she thought she was. She was. But I restrained myself. Instead, I took a deep breath and decided to steer the conversation towards my idea. "Margaret, what exactly is this startup you're working on with Paul?" I asked, trying to keep my tone neutral. She looked surprised by the question. "It's a wellness app," she said quietly. "Something to help people manage stress and improve their mental health." I nodded, processing this information. "You never wanted to involve me in this." "Why?" Margaret sighed, wiping away a tear. "You were always so focused on your work, on physics. I didn't think you'd be interested." "Well, you're wrong," I said firmly. "I'm interested now and I have an idea." She looked up at me, confusion and curiosity mingling in her expression. "What do you mean?" I know your project is about to be presented to the public, but I want you and Paul to abandon it." Her eyes widened. "What? Why would we do that?" "Because I have something better," I replied. "I've been working on an article recently, and Jason, one of my best students, has written a coursework that I believe has real potential. I want you to pivot your startup to focus on scientific activity based on these works." Margaret looked taken aback. "Andrew, I don't know anything about science or technology." "I do," I said, "and Jason's work is impressive. Together we can make this work. You and Paul can handle the business side and I'll provide the scientific content." She was silent for a moment, processing what I had said. Finally, she nodded slowly. "Okay, we'll consider it." I could see the conflict in her eyes. "We'll talk more about this later," I said, standing up. "For now, I need some time alone." Margaret nodded, understanding. She remained on the bed as I walked out of the room, heading to my study. I needed to think, to plan, and to find a way to turn this idea into reality. There was still an hour and a half left before my usual bedtime, and I decided to use this time wisely. I needed to think about what other scientific works I could present at this new startup, aside from Jason's coursework and my recent article. The other student works hadn't been as inspiring, and I realized that as far as physics was concerned, I probably couldn't think of anything else immediately. Feeling the weight of the evening's events, I decided a walk might help clear my mind. I left the house and headed down the quiet streets, the cool evening air soothing my frayed nerves. As I walked, I wondered when this startup presentation was scheduled to take place. If it was very soon, we wouldn't have much time to pivot and prepare new material. I resolved that if necessary, I would make them hurry up. The walk helped me organize my thoughts, but it also made me realize that there was no point in waiting until the next day to start preparing. I decided to head back to the institute that same evening to gather my article and review Jason's coursework. There was still time to get there, and I could use the solitude of the empty halls to focus. The institute was almost deserted when I arrived, the occasional echo of my footsteps the only sound breaking the silence. I made my way to my office and sifted through the pile of papers on my desk. Finding my article, I reviewed it carefully, making mental notes of any adjustments or additional points I wanted to highlight for the startup. Next, I turned my attention to Jason's coursework. It was thorough and well-written, showcasing his potential brilliantly. I couldn't take it with me, as it had to remain in the Institute's archive, so I decided to carefully hide it among the other papers where it wouldn't be easily found. With the documents reviewed and safely stowed, I locked up my office and left the building. The night was darker now, with the streets illuminated by the occasional street lamp. As I walked home, I felt a strange sense of calm, as if the evening's events had provided a clarity I hadn't expected. But then something unexpected happened. As I was crossing the street, a car came screeching around the corner, heading straight for me. I barely had time to react. The car swerved at the last second, missing me by inches, and crashed into a lamppost. The impact was loud and the street was suddenly alive with noise. I rushed to the car, my heart pounding. The driver was slumped over the steering wheel, unconscious but breathing. I pulled out my phone and called 911, giving them the details and location of the accident. As I waited for the emergency services to arrive, I couldn't help but think about how fragile life was and how quickly everything could change. When the paramedics and police arrived, I gave them a statement and watched as they carefully extricated the driver from the wreckage. It turned out he had been drinking, and his erratic driving was the result of impaired judgment. The police thanked me for my help and I continued on my way home, shaken but unhurt. I arrived home to find Margaret sitting in the living room, her eyes red from crying. She looked up as I walked in, concern evident on her face. "Andrew, are you okay? You've been gone so long." I'm fine, I replied, sitting down across from her. There was an accident on the way back. A drunk driver almost hit me. Her eyes widened in shock. Oh my God, Andrew, are you sure you're okay? Yes, I'm fine, just a little shaken. Margaret nodded, tears welling up again. I'm so sorry for everything, Andrew. I don't know how to make it right. You will fix everything if our startup is successful, I said and smiled. She looked up and her eyes lit up with hope. Really? She said. I replied, of course. I knew to myself that naturally I wouldn't forgive her, and no startup would help her redeem herself. But still, I wanted to make the most of the situation for myself. The next morning I woke up early, the events of the previous night still fresh in my mind. Margaret was already awake, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, staring at her phone. Morning, I said, grabbing a mug and filling it with coffee. Morning, she replied softly. She looked up at me and I could see the strain in her eyes. We didn't speak much as we ate breakfast. The silence between us was thick, filled with unspoken words and unresolved feelings. After a while, Margaret took a deep breath and picked up her phone, dialing a number. She waited for a moment, then started speaking. Paul, it's Margaret. We need to talk, she said, her voice trembling slightly. I could hear the muffled sound of Paul yelling on the other end, his words indistinct but angry. Margaret winced but held her ground. Listen, there's no way out of this. We have to change our startup plans. Andrew found out everything, and he wants us to pivot to a new project. If you don't agree, I'll stop working with you. And our communication will end, too. There was a long silence, during which Margaret looked like she might break down. Finally, Paul's voice came through the phone again, quieter this time. Reluctantly, he agreed. Their original startup idea, whatever it was about, was officially canceled. We had 2 days left before the public presentation, so we dove into preparing the new project immediately. The dynamics between Margaret and Paul had shifted dramatically. It was clear from the way he spoke to her on the phone and in person that any love he had for her had turned into resentment. He agreed to the new plan, but his cooperation was laced with bitterness. Meanwhile, I informed Jason, my best student, about the opportunity to present his coursework as part of our new startup project. His eyes lit up with excitement when I told him the news. Are you serious, Mr. Bell? This is amazing, Jason exclaimed. I'd love to be part of this. We spent the next 2 days in a whirlwind of preparation. Margaret, Paul, Jason, and I worked together to get everything ready. Margaret's demeanor towards me changed noticeably. She became more caring and attentive, perhaps trying to mend the rift between us. It was evident she was no longer romantically involved with Paul, who now treated her with barely concealed disdain. But he was even more uncomfortable with me. It seemed like he was ready to go under the ground to avoid seeing me, but I didn't care. The project came first. In our meetings, Paul's frustration was palpable. He barely spoke to Margaret unless necessary, and when he did, his tone was cold. It was clear that the situation had destroyed whatever affection he once had for her. Margaret, on the other hand, seemed to be going through a difficult time. She still harbored some hope that if the project was successful, I might forgive her and Paul might stop being angry with her. Despite the tension, we managed to pull together a compelling presentation. Jason's coursework was impressive, and integrating it into a new scientific startup concept gave the project a solid foundation. I focused on the scientific aspects, ensuring that the details were accurate and impactful. Throughout this process, I noticed that Margaret's efforts to reconcile with me were sincere. She was more involved in the project than I had ever seen her before, perhaps using it as a way to atone for her actions. However, my feelings towards her had changed. I treated her more like a neighbor than a wife, keeping our interactions professional and detached. By the end of the second day, we were exhausted but prepared. The presentation was ready, and we had done everything we could to make the new startup concept viable. That night, as Margaret and I lay in bed, the silence between us was less heavy but still present. She turned to me, her eyes searching mine. "Andrew, do you think we can ever move past this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I played along with her. "Of course, if our startup succeeds, everything depends only on that," I replied. The startup presentation was scheduled for Friday at 6 p.m. That day I went to the institute as usual, completing my classes and gathering the necessary materials for the evening. After my last lecture, I headed to the archive to retrieve Jason's coursework, ensuring I wrote an explanatory note about why I was taking it out. With everything prepared, I made my way to the venue where the startup event was taking place. The room buzzed with energy as people arrived, a mix of investors, scientists, and tech enthusiasts. The atmosphere was a blend of excitement and curiosity, the air thick with anticipation. Margaret and Paul were already there when I arrived. Margaret looked anxious but determined, while Paul seemed detached, avoiding eye contact with everyone, especially me. Jason was there too, a bundle of nerves and enthusiasm. We had done our best to pivot the project, focusing on the scientific potential of Jason's coursework and my article. As the clock ticked closer to 6 p.m., I took a deep breath and mentally prepared for what was to come. When it was time, I stepped up to the podium to present our new startup concept. I could feel the eyes of the audience on me, a mix of curiosity and skepticism. I started by introducing the core idea, explaining the scientific foundation and its potential applications. Jason followed with a detailed explanation of his coursework, his passion and knowledge shining through. As we spoke, I could see interest sparking in the eyes of several attendees. They leaned forward, listening intently and whispering to each other. By the time we finished, the room erupted in applause. It was clear that our pivot had been successful. The article and coursework had impressed those present, capturing their interest and sparking numerous questions. After the presentation, many scientists and investors approached us, eager to learn more. They were enthusiastic about the potential of our new direction, offering words of encouragement and asking detailed questions about the project. It felt like a victory, a small step towards rebuilding what had been broken. Paul, however, remained aloof. He answered questions perfunctorily, looking as if he wanted to be anywhere but there. His interactions with Margaret were curt and dismissive, the resentment between them palpable. As the event wound down, Margaret approached me with a hopeful look. "Andrew, would you like to go home together and celebrate? We did well today." I shook my head. "You go ahead, Margaret. I still need to answer some questions from the attendees. I'll come home later." Her face fell, but she nodded. "Okay, I'll see you at home then." Paul left almost immediately after the event concluded, not bothering to say goodbye. It was clear he wanted to distance himself from the entire situation as quickly as possible. I spent the next hour talking to various scientists and investors, answering their questions and discussing potential collaborations. The interest in our project was genuine, and it felt good to be in a professional environment where my work was valued and respected. When it was finally over, I headed home, my mind a swirl of thoughts. Margaret was waiting for me in the living room, a glass of wine in her hand. She looked up as I entered, a tentative smile on her face. "How did it go?" she asked. "Good. A lot of interest from potential collaborators," I replied, sitting down across from her. "I'm glad," she said softly. "I know things are complicated between us right now, but I hope we can work through this." I sighed, running a hand through my hair. "Margaret, this project is a start, but it's going to take more than a successful startup to fix what happened." I said, "I've already found time for myself tomorrow when I'll file for divorce." But for now, I've been playing along with Margaret. She nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. I understand. I'm willing to do whatever it takes. The next morning, I woke up early, ready to start a new chapter of my life. As I got dressed, I noticed Margaret in a surprisingly good mood. She was humming a tune as she prepared breakfast, her optimism seemingly stemming from the success of our startup presentation. "Where are you going?" she asked cheerfully, noticing me putting on my shoes. "It's Saturday. You can handle all your college business from home today." I paused for a moment, considering my words carefully. "First, I have to meet some new acquaintances," I said. Then, after a brief hesitation, I added, "And then I'm going to file for divorce." Her smile vanished, replaced by a look of shock. "What?" "But everything worked out for us." I looked at her directly, meeting her eyes. "Wonderful that it worked out. Did you really think that a successful startup would change everything and cover up your betrayal?" "I don't need anything from you anymore. You're free." Without waiting for a response, I turned and left the house. Margaret was speechless, unable to do anything to stop me. As I said, I went straight to the courthouse and filed for divorce. The process was straightforward, and I felt a strange sense of relief as I handed over the papers. From there, I headed to my meeting with the new acquaintances I had made at the startup event. The meeting was lively and engaging. I met several scientists, both independent and affiliated with various companies, as well as a few teachers from other institutes. The discussions were fascinating, filled with ideas and potential collaborations. It was invigorating to be among such a diverse group of minds. At one point, I brought up Jason's term paper, explaining how it had been the foundation for our new startup direction. The scientists were impressed, expressing admiration for Jason's work, despite him being just an ordinary student. "Jason's potential is incredible," one of the scientists remarked. "He should consider studying at a more prestigious institution." Another scientist nodded in agreement. With his talent, he could excel anywhere. I felt a surge of pride for Jason. Knowing his background, I realized how much this opportunity meant to him. His parents were quite poor, but they had always supported his education, fostering an environment where he could thrive. After the meeting concluded and everyone went their separate ways, I felt a tap on my shoulder. I turned to see Peter, the old colleague I had run into earlier in the week. "Peter, I didn't see you at the startup," I said, genuinely surprised. Peter smiled. "I was there, but I wanted to congratulate you personally, one-on-one. Your presentation was excellent, and your wife organized everything perfectly. You did a fantastic job, Andrew." I thanked him, feeling a pang of sadness at the mention of Margaret. "Thanks, Peter. It means a lot coming from you." As we chatted, my phone buzzed repeatedly. Margaret was calling, but I ignored the calls. I wasn't ready to talk to her, and I needed space to figure out my next steps. "What's next for you, Andrew?" Peter asked. "Honestly, I don't know," I replied. "But I'm excited to find out." The rest of the day passed in a blur of conversations and new connections. The support from my peers and the interest in Jason's work bolstered my spirits. Despite the turmoil in my personal life, I felt a renewed sense of purpose professionally. When I finally returned home that evening, Margaret was waiting for me. Her face was a mix of hope and desperation. "Andrew, can we talk?" I sighed, feeling the weight of the day catch up to me. "Not now, Margaret. I need time." She nodded, tears welling up in her eyes again. "Okay, I'll be here when you're ready." As I went to bed that night, I couldn't help but reflect on how quickly things had changed. The next morning, as I changed out of my pajamas and into my clothes, Margaret burst into the room, her face twisted with anger. She grabbed my arm, trying to stop me from leaving. "Andrew, you can't just walk out on me like this. You can't just file for divorce and leave me." I sighed, prying her fingers off my arm. Margaret, say whatever you want. It doesn't matter. Soon you won't be in my life anymore. Her eyes blazed with fury. You think you're so righteous, don't you? You think you're better than everyone else. You're nothing but a self-righteous abuser. I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. Margaret, call me whatever names you want. It doesn't change the facts. We're done. She spat more insults at me, her words growing more hysterical by the second. Finally, she ran to her room, slamming the door behind her, and I could hear her sobbing through the walls. I went to the kitchen, poured myself some cereal, and sat down to eat. The morning was quiet except for Margaret's distant crying. Despite everything, it felt oddly peaceful to be moving on. As I finished my breakfast, there was a knock at the door. I stood up and went to answer it. On the threshold stood an unremarkable man with a gray beard. He introduced himself as Robin Matthews. Good morning, Mr. Bell. My name is Robin Matthews. I represent the interests of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. I raised an eyebrow, surprised but intrigued. Nice to meet you, Mr. Matthews. What brings you here? He smiled warmly. During the startup presentation, we were quite impressed with your article. After consulting with my colleagues, we decided to invite you to present your article at MIT. If everything goes well, there might even be a job opportunity for you. My heart skipped a beat. That's incredible. I would love to take on that opportunity. Matthews nodded. In that case, we will need you to take a sort of leave from the institute where you currently teach. This would be an internship of sorts. I can arrange that, I said, feeling a surge of excitement. I'll take care of it today and be ready to leave whenever you need me. Excellent, Matthews replied. We would like you to be ready to leave the day after tomorrow. After Matthews left, I wasted no time. I contacted the administration office at my institute and explained the situation, requesting an immediate leave of absence. They were understanding, given the prestigious nature of the opportunity, and granted my request without hesitation. About an hour later, Margaret came down the stairs, her face blotchy from crying. I heard everything, she said, her voice strained. You're leaving, right? I looked at her, trying to keep my tone even. Yes, I'm leaving. I don't know how long this will take. In any case, our house is registered to my parents. I have nothing to worry about, so I can go there calmly. Margaret's eyes filled with tears again. You're a fuck, she spat before turning and storming back upstairs. I chose to remain silent, not wanting to escalate the situation further. Her words stung, but I knew responding would only make things worse. Instead, I decided to reach out to my daughter, Stephanie. She was 23 and had moved to Winnipeg, Canada to live with her husband. I dialed her number and after a few rings, she picked up. Hey, Dad, how are you? She asked, her voice bright and cheerful. Hey, Steph, I'm doing well. I have some big news, I said, trying to match her enthusiasm. Oh, what's up? She asked. Curiosity piqued. I told her about the opportunity at MIT and how I would be leaving soon to pursue it. Stephanie was genuinely happy for me, her excitement palpable through the phone. Dad, that's amazing. I'm so proud of you. You've always been such a hard worker. You deserve this, she said, her support lifting my spirits. Thanks, Steph. It means a lot to hear you say that, I replied, feeling a surge of warmth. We chatted for a while longer, catching up on her life in Winnipeg. She was doing well, enjoying her new city and her life with her husband. Talking to her was a welcome distraction from the chaos at home. After hanging up, I turned my attention back to practical matters. I needed to inform the court where I had filed for divorce about my departure and request a transfer of the trial date. Given the significance of the opportunity, I hoped they would understand and accommodate my request. I called the courthouse and explained the situation to the clerk. I'm leaving for a significant job opportunity at MIT and I need to request a transfer of the trial date, I said, my tone earnest. The clerk was understanding. Mr. Bell, given the nature of your request, we can certainly look into rescheduling your trial. Please provide any documentation related to your job opportunity, and we'll process the transfer. I sent over the necessary documents and waited anxiously for their response. Later that day, I received confirmation that my trial date had been rescheduled, allowing me to focus on my new venture without the immediate pressure of the divorce proceedings. The day had finally arrived. I packed my bags and loaded them into the car, ready for the drive from New York to Massachusetts. It was a relatively short journey, only about 2.5 hours. The drive was smooth, the road ahead clear. I used the time to think about the presentation and how I would convey my ideas. The scenery changed gradually from the familiar landscapes of New York to the bustling cityscape of Boston. When I arrived, I found a cheap hostel that was reasonable by state standards and checked in, grateful for a place to rest my head. After settling into my room, I decided to grab a bite to eat. I found a small diner nearby and enjoyed a quick meal, the simple act of eating calming my nerves. It was almost time to head to MIT, and I wanted to be ready. I arrived at MIT with time to spare. Robin Matthews was waiting for me, his demeanor as professional as ever. "Welcome, Andrew," he said, shaking my hand. "Are you ready for your presentation?" "Absolutely," I replied, my confidence growing. Robin led me to the lecture hall where the presentation would take place. The room was filled with faculty members, scientists, and other staff, all eager to hear about my work. When I finished my speech, I scanned the room for any clear emotions from the learned professors and scientists. But their faces remained inscrutable. They exchanged glances and murmured among themselves, making it hard to gauge their reactions. Robin Matthews stepped forward, breaking the silence. "Thank you for your presentation, Andrew," he said. "You're free for today. Please don't leave the state until we make a final decision about your internship. It will take a maximum of a few days." I nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. Of course, he'll stay nearby. With that, I left the lecture hall, feeling a mix of uncertainty and anticipation. The next 2 days were spent exploring Boston, immersing myself in the city's rich history and vibrant culture. I strolled through Boston Common, visited the museums, and soaked in the atmosphere of this new city. It was a welcome distraction from the tension of waiting. During these days, Margaret called me numerous times. The first time she called, I had just returned from MIT. I picked up, bracing myself for whatever she had to say. "Andrew, you acted in the most vile way. You're a real asshole. Do you know that?" she began, her voice filled with anger and bitterness. I listened in silence, letting her vent. It was nothing I hadn't heard before. Finally, I interrupted her mid-rant. "Margaret, I can't do this right now," I said, and hung up the phone. From that point on, I ignored her calls, focusing on the opportunity ahead. On the third day of my stay in Boston, my phone rang again. This time it was my old friend Peter, the one I had seen at the startup. "Andrew, it's Peter," he said, his voice tinged with anxiety. "I need to tell you something about Margaret." I felt a knot form in my stomach. "What is it, Peter? She's been suffering all this time, Andrew." When I saw her at the startup, I could tell something was wrong. "Yesterday I decided to check in on her at your house. I found something terrible. Margaret has some kind of illness that she had hidden from you. It was in a latent form, but the severe stress must have triggered it. She's been hospitalized, and things aren't looking good." I absorbed his words, feeling a mix of concern and suspicion. Was this real, or was Margaret staging a performance to get me back? Could she have gone to such lengths, perhaps even poisoning herself? "Thank you for letting me know, Peter," I said finally. "I'll think about what to do." After I hung up, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. Despite everything, I had to consider the possibility that Margaret's condition was genuine, but I also had to stay focused on my future. A few hours later, I received an email notification. It was from Robin Matthews. I opened it, my heart pounding. Dear Andrew, we are pleased to inform you that we have decided to offer you an internship at MIT. Congratulations and welcome aboard. We look forward to working with you. Best regards, Robin Matthews. I felt a surge of joy and relief. The opportunity I had worked so hard for was now within reach. A few days later, I received a call from Peter. His voice was calmer this time, but the news was no less disturbing. Andrew, it turns out you were right, he said. Margaret did try to poison herself. She ingested something that severely affected her kidneys. When they performed hemodialysis and removed the toxins, the doctors confirmed it. The good news is that her life isn't in danger anymore. I took a deep breath, processing the information. Thanks for letting me know, Peter. I'm relieved she's going to be okay. Yeah, it was a close call. Take care, Andrew, Peter said before hanging up. Meanwhile, I had been fully immersed in my internship at MIT for several days now. The experience was nothing short of fascinating. Being surrounded by some of the brightest minds in the field and engaging in cutting-edge research was invigorating. Despite my immersion in the internship, I knew I had to face the unresolved issues back home. Loomed. I had to return to New York to finalize everything and officially end our marriage. In addition to dealing with the divorce, I was also planning a trip to Winnipeg to visit Stephanie and finally meet her husband. They had got married there, and I had yet to visit them in their new home. The thought of seeing my daughter and reconnecting with her brought a sense of anticipation and joy. Margaret was a fool to poison herself in the hope that I'd go back to her. I couldn't even imagine who I ended up marrying. These thoughts were frequent visitors as I strolled through Boston.